Hello. So the topic from this term that actually interested me the most and that I chose to pursue for this final project was the topics that we discussed in Module 4, where we looked at the development of intergroup cognition and the foundations of social group preferences. So the first study we looked at was one by Kinsler and colleagues, where these researchers conducted several small studies to examine infants and young children's behaviors, attitudes, and preferences towards individuals speaking a language that was familiar to them and native to them, and individuals who spoke a language that was unfamiliar to them. So their findings revealed that infants actually showed a preference towards individuals who spoke a familiar language to them, as opposed to individuals who spoke a language that they were unfamiliar with. And this was showed by preferential looking, and also by choosing to engage and interact with the individual by either becoming their friend, which was shown in 5-year-olds, and choosing a toy that the speaker offered, which was shown in 10-month-olds. So in all cases, they chose to interact with, engage with, and befriend the speaker who was speaking a language that was familiar to them as opposed to unfamiliar to them. And so we know that different cultures and different races speak different languages. And so what I was curious about was whether we could extrapolate these biases and preferences that individuals or that infants and children showed towards familiar language, if we could extrapolate that and relate it to race as opposed to language. And so specifically, do infants and young children also show preferences and behavioral attitudes towards individuals based on race? So we looked at another article by Pun in Module 4, Pun and colleagues. So here what the researchers were investigating was whether infants base their preferences on positive evaluations of familiar language speakers, negative evaluations of unfamiliar language speakers, or a combination of the two. So what they found was that infants at 1 year of age were actually more likely to associate positively valenced stimuli, such as fruit, with an individual speaking their own language than they were with an individual speaking another language. And similarly, they were also more likely to associate pro-social behavior with an individual speaking their own language than with an individual speaking a different language. However, they did not expect a person speaking another language to behave antisocially, and they did not more readily associate a negative stimuli, such as a spider or something, with that individual. So what this article showed was that there was a strong positive evaluation for individuals speaking a familiar language, but there was not a corresponding negative evaluation of individuals speaking an unfamiliar language. And so again, similar to what I was mentioning about the Kinsler article, is whether we can extrapolate these findings of infants showing positive associations with familiar language speakers to them showing similar positive associations for individuals based on race. So again, specifically, do infants show positive associations based on race and not language? So finally, the last article that we looked at in Module 4 was one by Zhao and colleagues, and here these researchers were examining whether infants associated faces of their own race with a positive valence and faces of another race with a negative valence, and specifically this was happy and sad music. And what they found was that at 3 months of age, infants showed absolutely no preference for their own race or dislike for the other race, and showed no associations with either for happy or sad music. But by 9 months of age, infants were more likely to associate the happy music with people of their own race and the sad music with people from another race. And so this just suggests that infants are not predisposed to make associations like this, and it's developed through experience. Our article did to some extent answer my question regarding whether or not we can extrapolate preferences that infants show based on language to preferences of race by demonstrating that by 9 months of age, infants do hold a positive and negative association based on unfamiliar and familiar races. However, what I was curious about was whether these negative associations of other race faces were due to unfamiliarity, because in the Zhao article, infants had never been exposed to any other race. They were Chinese and had only ever been exposed to Chinese faces. So I did some more research, I did some digging, and I actually came across an article by Jensen and Psyc. So in their article, these researchers were examining whether young children displayed a preference for their own race and a discrimination towards another race. And specifically, they examined whether children attributed pro-social behavior to groups that were more like them and aggressive behavior to groups that were unlike them. So what differed this article from the one that we looked at written by Pun and colleagues who were also looking at pro-social and antisocial behavior was the fact that instead of presenting children with familiar and unfamiliar languages, they presented them with images of different races. What they found was actually that not only that children had a preference for individuals of their own race and were more likely to attribute pro-social behavior with their own race, but they were actually more likely to attribute negative and aggressive behavior with the other race that was not similar to their own. And so this was new and surpassed what Pun found, which indicated that children held no negative attributions or negative associations to people speaking an unfamiliar language. So it was found that when it came to race, that children did actually hold negative associations towards people of a different race than their own. Sorry, my voice is just completely gone. So after reading this article, I was really curious to see whether these biases and preferences and attitudes towards other races, how this influenced their everyday life and their choices and behaviors that they made. So I kept doing some more research, and I found an article by Chen and Graham, and what these researchers were looking at was what factors influence the likelihood that Asian students would form cross-ethnic friendships, and more specifically, whether they were likely to befriend other Asian students or whether they were likely to befriend white students who were usually the majority and dominant ethnic group in their school, as opposed to a minority ethnic group like Latinos, blacks, and so on. And so what they found was that Asian students disproportionately favored their same ethnicity and were more likely to become friends with other Asian students if the makeup of the school allowed for it. And when it didn't, when there weren't enough Asian students to befriend, they were more likely to choose white friends as opposed to other ethnically minor groups to be friends with. So the other study that I looked at was by Larochette, Murphy, and Craig, and what these people were looking at was between students aged 11 to 15, which was the same as actually what Chen and Graham were looking at in Asian students choosing friendships. Their sample was also students aged 11 to 15. Sorry, I should have mentioned that. But so in this study, they were looking at what individual and school-related factors were associated with racial bullying and racial victimization. And they looked at a variety of schools that were ethnically diverse, or whether they had a majority and a minority. It was just a wide range of schools. And what they found was that experiences of racial bullying and victimization were really strongly correlated to individual factors like a person's race, as opposed to school climate factors such as the socioeconomic status of the school and things like that. But I also found that these experiences of bullying and victimization based on race could be really highly mediated if the teachers of the school were ethnically diverse and supportive. And by supportive, I mean that teachers were accepting of students as human beings, regardless of their race, and they were also really highly reactive to acts of racial bullying and racial victimization. And so there was very negative reactions to students carrying out such behaviors. So after doing all this research of the articles that I discussed and many more that I didn't really get to include in this video, the gap in the literature I found was surrounding the premise that we know that really young children and infants have biases and preferences and attitudes towards people of a different race, and while we know that older children aged 11 to 15 have allow these attitudes and preferences to, affect their behavior and their friend choice and I guess bullying and victimization and things like that. There's still a gap in the middle of this middle age range where we don't know if they display similar behaviors as those older children and whether they engage in discriminatory behavior. And so my question was whether children aged 5 to 10 also engage in discriminatory behavior. If they do, at what age does this develop? And can these behaviors be mediated if children are to be exposed to ethnically diverse groups from a young age? So I hypothesize that very young children will not engage in these discriminatory behaviors, similar to the ones that were displayed in the Larachette article from children aged 11 to 15. So I don't believe that younger children aged 5 to 10 would engage in racial discrimination and bullying. So this hypothesis that I'm making is actually based on an article we looked at in Module 7 by Buttleman and Baum. So Buttleman and Baum were examining whether 6 to 8-year-olds demonstrated an in-group bias in their distribution of positive and negative resources, and specifically what motivations underlay these behaviors. So they discovered an underlying motivation of in-group love among all age groups because subjects allocated a majority of positive items to their in-group. However, they found out-group hate as a motivator only among older participants who were 8 years old and who intentionally harmed the out-group by allocating them negative objects. And so we can extrapolate, the term in-group and out-group that in this article was based on t-shirt color to race. And I guess based on this, we can, make a prediction that children, younger children are not likely to, have discriminatory behavior towards people in their outgroup or towards a race that's dissimilar to their own until older ages. So the method for this study that I wanted to use was one similar to Buttleman and Baum. So I wanted to examine the age group between 5 and 10 that falls from kindergarten to just right before middle school starts. And I wanted to look at children coming from a very diverse background, specifically their school background. So the schools would range from being very ethnically diverse to, predominantly being white or maybe having two dominant ethnic groups of the school. So specifically, I wanted to look at white students and their biases and how their biases affect their behavior. And so the procedure would be that they would come in and it would be a computer task, and they would be presented with an image. You can just see it right here in the slide. But they would be presented with a face of a child similar to their age range who was either white or, a different race, whether it be Asian, Black, Latino, or another race. And then at the top of the screen, there would be a series of objects, and they would alternate at the end of, every time they clicked one or the other. And so students could, or participants could allocate the object either to their own race, another race, or there was a trash can in the middle where they could discard the object if they didn't want to give it to either of them. And at the start of the study, they were told, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So there was positively valenced objects and negatively valenced objects, and at the start of the study, they were even told that neither prefers these negative objects, but all of them prefer the positive objects. And so students went through all these trials. So my expected results. So I think that across all age groups, we are going to see a preference for our own race. So participants are probably going to allocate more of the positive items to themselves across all age groups to races that coincide with their own race. However, I think that in the age groups of 5 to 7, we're probably going to see much less outgroup harm or outgroup hate, and I think that most children aged 5 to 7 aren't going to allocate the negative objects to the other race to cause them harm. I think that they're going to discard those items. But I think that around the 8 to 10-year-old range, we are going to see more of that behavior. However, I think that that will really strongly depend on their experience with ethnic diversity. And so I think that if their school was really ethnically diverse, this will really mediate the effect to which that they're going to allocate those negative items to the race that doesn't coincide with their own. So they're not going to be likely to engage in discriminatory behavior. So the implications that this study would have is essentially that we can, reduce discrimination and racial bullying and racial victimization and racial biases and all the like if we expose children to a variety of different races from a young age. So I think that it's important for parents to be, aware of, the different races that their kids are interacting with, and make sure that they're interacting with an ethnically diverse group. I think it's important for parents themselves to interact with ethnically diverse groups and, set an example for their kids. I think it's important maybe for, school boards and things like that to take this into account. Maybe teachers to take it into account, if they're pairing people up to sit next to desks with each other, or sit, next to each other in desks, or putting them in groups for projects and things like that. I think it would be important for all these individuals to take the results, my expected results, and really factor them into how they allow children to allocate their time with different racial groups. Okay, I really struggled with filming this. I hope it was good. I'm sorry for my voice and my terrible editing skills. Thanks for a great course. Bye.